Way back in 2020, long before we were on TikTok, we started testing the most interesting chef knives on the market. Some of those became our daily drivers, many we gave away, but over the last 6 months, we bought 21 more, bringing our total knife review count up to 40. That's not including the ones that we tested the first time and wanted to give another chance, but there's also a few that were unique that we hadn't gotten to try yet, and some that were just too expensive the first time around. Regardless, all of them spent at least a few days as our primary knife in our home kitchen.
And we're gonna use the Shun Premier today.
For those of you who are new here, let's quickly go over Cult Slave's rules of buying cookware. Number 1, versatility beats everything. A chef's knife is a multitasking powerhouse, and that's why we keep coming back to it. No one with a good chef's knife has ever needed a knockery, no matter how much Milk Street might insist it's important. A bread knife is definitely useful, but Chad Robertson of Tartine, one of the most famous bakers on earth, still uses a chef's knife every day to cut his bread. Manufacturers would love to have you buy more knives, and there's definitely room to optimize, but let's not over-index on just having a bunch of knives that we don't necessarily need. Number 2, used good is better than new shitty. Please stop buying garbage knives and insisting it saves you time because you don't have to care for them as much as more expensive knives. You're just telling on yourself for how dull your knives are. I don't want you to have to spend any more money than necessary, but high quality knives require sharpening less often and thus less maintenance. If you think your shit knife doesn't require maintenance, you might just not know what a sharp knife feels like.
Good Lord.
This is a silly argument and it needs to go away. And number 3, build up over time. The industry has taught us to buy sets, but it's not a good idea for most people. Just get what you need, 1 unit at a time, and unequivocally, a multitasker like a chef's knife is a great place to start. I think there are basically 2 factors in knife buying, the steel and the smith. And that sounds a bit more romantic than it really is because most smiths today are robots. The steel typically comes in ingots or sheets from the foundry that produced it, and then the smiths, robotic or otherwise, do their grim work from there. Many manufacturers are working with the exact same steel, so it's up to how they use that steel to differentiate, which means the smith is far more important than the steel.
I found a new way to heat the steel. It's thinner, smaller, but just as strong.
Terrible knives are made out of great steels every day because it's what you do at the end of the process that really defines your day-to-day experience. The profile, the grind, the heat treatment, the handle design, those have the most impact. The steel definitely matters, but it's what the smith does with it that matters the most. And because of that, it's really hard to generalize knife advice. There are a few easy bits though. We'd recommend an 8-inch chef knife for most people. 10 inches is technically more efficient on push and pull cuts, but can be a bit unwieldy. If you've got smaller hands or mobility issues, don't be afraid to drop down to a 7-inch cook's knife. Control is important.
There we go.
On the other hand, most knife reviews put a lot of emphasis on handle shape, grippiness, and finger clearance, but we think those aren't quite as important as they're made out to be. It's not completely invalid, but it's a bit counterproductive because it caters to bad grip techniques like the hammer grip, which exchanges control for leverage that you don't actually need, or an overly tight pinch grip, which can cause your fingers to rub against the edges of the blade, and it causes wrist and hand discomfort. A more optimal grip pinches the blade gently, leaving room between your forefinger and the spine of the knife, and you just tuck your fingertips gently underneath the handle. This reduces hand and wrist discomfort, balances control with leverage, and means you actually don't feel much of the handle most of the time. We're putting several different profiles under the umbrella of chef's knife. There's a classic Western chef's knife, the Japanese gyuto and santoku, and the Chinese saidao, not to mention the many hybrids of those different profiles. There's a lot of guidance out there that says each of these profiles is better for specific jobs, but in my experience, there's really no difference in performance. They can all do general purpose tasks easily. If you're willing to put in the effort to wipe your knife down after use, carbon steel can be a nice upgrade because it gets a bit harder than stainless steel. But if not, there's no shame in just sticking with classic stainless steel. We at Cult Slave tend to focus on mainstream brands because widespread accessibility is important. Unfortunately, that's just not something independent smiths can compete with for the majority of the market. If you have a shop you trust, that's a great way to get a hold of some cool indie stuff, but don't sweat it if you can. As a general rule, we'd avoid any seller that won't tell you the actual name of their steel because it tends to be pretty poor stuff. The only manufacturer that hasn't burned us on this is Mac. You can just feel when you start to move through something, it just bites in and it goes perfectly straight. It's like it's on cruise control. We'd also avoid anyone selling 67-layer VG10 Damascus because those tend to be dropshippers who are just hawking AliExpress garbage. Then again, we'd also just generally avoid Damascus because it doesn't add anything in terms of performance. It can look cool, but it very rarely does. And of course, don't buy from Cutco. Our historical recommendations have been the Headley & Bennett chef's knife due to its great price to performance ratio, and the Kramer by Zwilling Carbon, which has excellent ergonomics and blade geometry despite its high price tag. Spoiler alert, those are not getting dethroned, but we do have some new recommendations to add to the list. We've already made a rundown of the most common knife steels to help you make sense of the complete alphabet soup that is a typical knife description. Over the next week or so, we'll also go over all of our smashes and passes to help you find a knife that you'll really love.